No niin, livenä ollaan. Ihanaa ja aurinkoista iltapäivää, hyvät katsojat, ja tervetuloa kautta aikojen ensimmäiseen TeostoTalks webinaariin. Good afternoon everyone and welcome to our new event concept TeostoTalks. Tämä TeostoTalks-tilaisuus on tällainen uudenlainen tiivis keskustelutapahtuma, joka olemme halunneet järjestää aina ennen Teoston virallista jäsenkokousta. Eli 2 kertaa vuodessa aikomuksemme on nyt järjestää tällaisia tilaisuuksia, joissa tiiviisti keskustellaan huippuasiantuntijoiden kanssa ajankohtaisesta musiikkialaa liikuttavista aiheista. Tämän tilaisuuden jälkeen sitten kello 16 niin jatkuu eri linkin kautta niin Teoston sitten sääntömääräinen kevätkokous, jossa on sitten tänään tehtävänä tärkeitä tähänkin tematiikkaan liittyviä päätöksiä. Ja siihen jäsenkokoukseenhan sitten on ollut ennakkoilmoittautuminen Teoston päättäville jäsenille. My name is Vappu Aura and I will be your host today. Minun nimeni on siis Vappu Aura ja olen Teoston viestintä- ja yhteiskuntasuhdejohtaja ja toimin tänään tällaisena juontajana ja tilaisuuden johdattelijana. Oikein paljon tervetuloa. Tänään aiheenamme on siis musiikin tekijöiden tulonmuodostus digitaalisilla alustoilla. Tämä aihehan on puhututtanut näin korona-aikana varmasti enemmän kuin koskaan ihan ympäri maailmaa ja myös täällä Suomessa. Me puhumme siitä, miten musiikin korvaukset digitaalisilta alustoilta kertyvät tekijöille ja kuinka ne ohjautuvat sitten sinne musiikin säveltäjille, sanottajille, sovittajille ja kustantajille. Ja lisäksi hieman vertailemme erilaisia jakomalleja, jotka ovat olleet kuuma peruna nyt viimeisien vuosien aikana. Puhumassa meillä on keynote-puheenvuoron pitäjänä brittiläisen mediayhtiön toimitusjohtaja ja aiheesta kirjankin kirjoittanut Cooke. Ja sen jälkeen kommenttipuheenvuoron pitää erityisesti näitä erilaisia malleja paljon tutkinut Suomen musiikkikustantien toiminnanjohtaja Jari Muikku. Tilaisuuden on tarkoitus kestää tasan tunti, eli sitten sinne loppuun pyritään jättämään aikaa myös teidän kysymyksille ja keskusteluille. Ja näitä kysymyksiä voitte laittaa siihen ruudun oikeassa reunassa näkyvään chat-kenttään. Minä sitten luen niitä sieltä sen jälkeen, kun Chrisin ja Jarin puheenvuorot on pidetty. Today we are talking about music creators' digital income from streaming platforms. This topic has caused more debate than ever during the COVID period. Our keynote speaker, Mr. Cooke, is the managing director of 3CM Unlimited and author of Dissecting the Digital Dollar. He will provide a concise overview of how music streaming works from a rights and royalties perspective, who licenses, how are royalties calculated, and how do monies flow. And after that, we hear a brief comment from Mr. Jari Muikku, who is a director at Finnish Music Publishers Association. And please write your comments and questions to the chat window on the right side of the screen. And in the end, we hopefully have some time to take some of your questions to the speakers. But now, it's time to start talking. So please, Chris, the stage is yours.
Can everyone hear me okay? All right, yes, I can hear myself back. I'm just going to put that on mute. So good afternoon, everybody. It's very exciting to be here today. I'm coming to you from my home office in East London, in lockdown in the UK for a little bit longer. And it's very exciting to be here today to talk to you about the Dissecting the Digital Dollar work that we have been doing here at CMU in partnership with the UK's Music Managers Forum and various insights from that research that we have to show to you today. So I'm going to now ask if the tech team could put my slides up on the screen and we will talk you through. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide here and I will quickly introduce myself. So this is me. My name is chriscooke.com is my website. It's where you can check me out online if you so wish. And if we go on to the next slide, you will see that I am the founder and managing director of CMU, which is a business based in London. We exist to help people navigate and understand the music business. And if we go on to the next slide, you'll see that we do that in a number of different ways. So we report on the music industry through our media, like the CMU Daily Bulletin and the Setlist podcast, and we have an online library. We do lots of training courses on trends in the music industry, lots of research work as well, and we present and organize at events all over the world. So that's what we do at CMU. But as I say, I'm here today specifically to talk about a particular piece of research that we've been working on since 2015, as it says on this slide. So we were engaged all the way back in 2015 by the Music Managers Forum here in the UK to basically investigate how the streaming business works. The reason why the MMF approached us about this project was here in the UK, it was around about 2014, 2015 that streaming really started to gain momentum, particularly as a revenue stream. And so significant amounts of money were starting to come in through the streaming services to the music industry. And as that money started to come in, artists and songwriters rightly started to ask of their managers, well, how does this work? My label, my publisher, my distributor, my collecting society is telling me that my streams generated €1,000, £1,000, $5,000 last month, last year, last quarter. What does that mean? How does my publisher, my distributor, my label, my collecting society, how do they know that the streams that occurred on Spotify and Deezer, etc., created that sort of money? And so increasingly, managers were being asked those questions by their clients, and the managers didn't know the answers to those questions. And so they started phoning up the MMF and saying, well, do you know how this works? When these deals were being done in the late 2000s, were you part of that conversation? And the MMF said, no, we weren't. And so the MMF came to us and said, okay, can you investigate how streaming works from a rights and royalties perspective? And so that's what we did. That then sparked a whole load of debates that continue to this day. And so over the years, we've published a number of guides, a number of reports, explaining the streaming business, explaining the different debates, and trying our best to give every side of the argument. We're not necessarily here to have strong opinions. Certainly CMU isn't. But as CMU, we're not here to have strong opinions. We're here to inform the debate. And hopefully that's what I can do for you here today. So if we go on to the next slide, basically what I'm going to talk to you about today is how streaming services are licensed. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, I'm going to talk to you very briefly about where the digital market is at as of 2021. And we will see why this conversation has become ever more important in recent years. Before I get into actually explaining how digital licensing works, I'm going to remind you about some of the basics of music copyright. For many of you in the audience, a lot of that will be very familiar, but there's a few music copyright facts that you need to understand in order to understand how the streaming business works. Then I'm going to talk about who is it in the music industry that actually has these relationships with the streaming services like Spotify. What does a streaming deal look like? And then perhaps most importantly of all, how do artists and songwriters get paid? So let's go into the first section on the next slide, and we'll go straight on to the next slide. And I just want to show you here, these are the global record industry's revenues in 2020. Okay, so if we take all of the money that came in last year through the record industry, through record companies and music distributors, this is approximately how that revenue breaks down, according to figures from the global organization IFPI. The most important thing you will notice is that last year, streaming was 62.1% of the global record industry. Now, this is recorded music. This is not the publishing side. This is not the song side. But you will see that for the record industry, streaming is now by far the biggest revenue generator, and it's still the fastest growing revenue stream as well. So let's go on to the next slide and have a look at some of the services that are generating that income. And I guess what we're interested in here today is with the Spotify's, Apple's, Amazons of this world, and the services which are important in certain emerging markets like Tencent in China and JioSaavn and Ghana in India. Who has the relationships from the music industry with these services, and what do those relationships look like? So that is what I'm going to explain in the next 20 minutes. But if we go on to the next slide, these are the questions which I want to answer here today for you, because these are the questions we need to answer in order to understand how streaming works. Also, these questions explain why it can seem quite complicated. The way the streaming business is quite complex. And it's by answering some of these questions that we understand why. Okay, so when a digital platform comes along, like Spotify, and you'll notice today, when I say Spotify, I mean a streaming service, a subscription streaming service. And I tend to use Spotify as code for that because globally, and certainly in your market, Spotify is by far the dominant player. So when Spotify is streaming music, what specific rights are being exploited in those streams? What elements of the copyright are being exploited in those streams? And then, as I've already alluded to, I want to know who actually does the deal between the music industry and the streaming service, and what does that deal look like? So if we go to the next slide, this is where we need to do some copyright facts. Okay, we need to get through some copyright facts in order for what I'm about to say to make sense. So let's start off with copyright fact number 1. I'm sure everybody tuning in today, you're well aware of this, that copyright law treats songs and recordings. And I should stress that when I say songs, I'm using that in a very wide sense of that word. Musical composition, melody, rhythm, and lyrics combined. I'm calling that songs. And we know that copyright protects songs, but crucially, it protects songs distinctly and separately from sound recordings. So we have 2 sets of music copyright. We have the song rights, or what you might call those publishing rights, or maybe author rights. And then we have the recording rights, master rights, phonographic rights, producer rights, different ways of saying the same thing. And because copyright law treats songs and recordings separately, so does the music industry. So we have the music publishing sector focused on the songs and the record industry on the recordings. Okay, let's go on to the next slide and delve a little bit deeper into music copyright. I like to define copyright as being a legal concept, a legal principle that is all about giving creative people control over the output of their creativity. That's what copyright is there for. So that as a creative person, when you create something, you have control over that something because of copyright. And actually, copyright law generally is more specific than that. Copyright law usually defines this idea of control in more detail. Now, obviously, every country has its own body of copyright law, and the exact rules, the exact terminology differs from country to country. But generally, in most copyright systems, you'll find something like this list of 6, maybe 7 controls that come with the copyright. Sometimes we refer to those as the rights that come with the copyright. Under UK copyright law, we refer to these as the restricted acts of the copyright. I'm using the word controls. And as a copyright owner, you have control over the reproduction, distribution, rental, adaptation, performance, and communication, and making available of your music. The reason why I have making available there below communication is some people see making available actually as a subset of the communication control. Quick terminology point on the next slide. In the music industry, we tend to group the first 2 together and talk about mechanical rights, and the latter 2 we tend to group together and call the performing rights. Or in some countries on the recorded side, we now refer to those as neighboring rights. Bit confusing because neighboring rights has different definitions around the world, but we're here from a song perspective, we would call those the performing rights. So let's go on to the next slide. An interesting question. When music is being streamed, which elements of the copyright are being exploited? Because you will notice on that last slide, there wasn't a streaming control. There wasn't a digital control. So when streaming services first came along, we had to answer the question, well, which elements of the copyright are being exploited when music streams? And it was decided by the industry that both the reproduction element of the copyright and the communication, probably making available element of the copyright were both being exploited when music streams. So to use music industry jargon, that means that the mechanical rights and the performing rights of the copyright are being exploited at the same time whenever music streams. And that can be important when it comes to licensing services and processing the money. Okay, next slide. I've said several times already, what we want to know is, when it comes to the relationships between the music industry and the streaming services, who has that relationship? Who negotiates the deal? Is it record labels and music publishers? Is it collecting societies? Is it music distributors? Or is it entities set up specifically to do the licensing, copyright hubs and licensing agencies? If we go to the next slide, I'm going to start answering these many, many questions that I've now already asked in the 10 minutes that I've been speaking here today. So let's just put those copyright facts into action. It goes without saying, really, doesn't it, that when music streams, what is streaming is a recording of a song. So both the recording rights and the song rights are being exploited by definition when music streams. And remember, if you want to be more specific in terms of the elements of the copyright being exploited, the music industry decided that both mechanical rights and performing rights are exploited at the same time whenever music streams. Okay, let's go on to the next slide and let's get into talking about who in the music industry manages the relationships with these streaming services. I'll quickly start with recorded music. On the recorded music side, in the main, the collecting societies, the collective licensing system, are not involved. They may get involved with very basic webcasting, but when it comes to a Spotify type service, it is record labels who negotiate the deals. However, there are an awful lot of record labels in the world. If you think of all the independent labels worldwide, that's thousands and thousands of labels. Not to mention the fact we are now in an era where millions of artists at the start of their career self-release. A service like Spotify does not want to have to do deals with thousands of indie labels, let alone millions of DIY artists. And so therefore, there is a role for intermediaries here. So, for example, the indie sector has an organization called Merlin that negotiates template deals on behalf of its indie label members. And then we have the distributors, commercial companies that aggregate rights and do deals. So if we go to the next slide, you will see that if you were licensing a streaming service today on the recorded side, you would do deals with the major record companies and their distribution divisions. You would do a deal with this organization called Merlin. And then you would get all of the other rights by working with the music distributors. So that's what's happening on the recorded side. Labels and distributors and Merlin are negotiating the deals. But what about the song rights? Let's go to the next slide. As soon as you've done a deal with a label or a distributor, that label or distributor starts uploading recordings into your server as a streaming service. Contained in every one of those recordings is a song. The label and distributor, of course, is not able to grant a license for those songs. So therefore, the streaming service needs to separately license the song rights. That is mainly done through the collective licensing system. So collecting societies will license services, their repertoires, through the licensing deals that are done from societies to streaming services. But again, there are a lot of collecting societies in the world because every country probably has at least one collecting society representing songwriters and publishers and the song rights. In some countries, like the UK, we actually have two societies, one for mechanical rights and one for performing rights. Remember, a streaming service needs to cover both elements of the copyright. So, a lot of societies to do deals with. The good news for streaming services like Spotify is that societies have started to collaborate on licensing. So, for example, here in the UK, our Performing Rights Society and our Mechanical Rights Society, PRS and MCPS, collaborate on digital licensing. Meanwhile, if we go on to the next slide, we'll also see that societies in different countries have started to collaborate on digital licensing. So we have the Polaris Initiative with some of the Nordic markets, and then we have organizations like ICE, which involves STIM, Gamer, and PRS. And basically, this allows streaming services to do one set of deals and talks where multiple society repertoires are brought to the table. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. And let's throw in an added complication, which is that although generally on the song side, collecting societies, CMOs, PROs, whichever terminology you prefer, societies are doing the deal. Societies are granting the license. But there's a big exception, which is that many publishers now license their Anglo-American repertoires through direct deals. So in addition to the society deals, we have direct deals. Although there's an extra complication there, which is that actually publishers only have the power to license the mechanical rights of the Anglo-American repertoire, not the performing rights. So the societies have to form partnerships No, hang on. The publishers have to form partnerships with the societies that represent the performing rights if they want to include the performing rights in those direct deals. So for the next slide, we will see that when you're a streaming service, as well as all of those society deals that we need to do, we need to go and do some direct deals with the publishers covering Anglo-American repertoire. In some cases, actually, those deals will only cover the mechanical rights, and the service will have to go and get a separate deal from a society covering the performing rights. But in many cases, the publisher has already done a deal with the societies, so that actually the Sony deal, the Universal deal, the Warner deal do include the performing rights of the societies as well. I think the next slide is a good summary. Basically, when it comes to licensing the song rights, it can be complicated because a service like Spotify needs to do deals with publishers, which will cover some rights. They need to do deals with societies, which will cover some rights. And whenever they are licensing, they always have to remember that they need to have both mechanical rights and performing rights covered. And in some cases, that might require different deals. Okay, next slide. I've talked a lot about the deal. What is the deal? So let's explain this. Several times a year, you will probably see on social media, everybody starts sharing a little JPEG, which is a rate card of the per play rates that you are paid when you get an Apple stream or a Spotify stream or a YouTube stream and so on. Those charts are actually very misleading because there are no per play rates. That's not how streaming works. Yes, in any one month, we can average the number of streams by the amount of money we received and calculate a per stream rate. But there isn't actually a per stream rate in the deal because streaming is a revenue share business. It is a revenue share based on total consumption share business. Let me explain to you what that means. If we go on to the next slide. Basically, what a service like Spotify has to do every month is this 4-step plan in order to pay everybody what they are due. First of all, step 1 is that we have to allocate money to tracks. And we do that based on consumption. Once a track has an allocation, we then have to share that allocation with labels and distributors on the recording side and publishers and societies on the song side, and make sure that all of those licensing partners are paid their share. So first of all, let me explain to you what I mean by the track allocation. So let's go on to the next slide, and that will explain that for you. So this is basically what Spotify does every month. It says, okay, how much money did we make selling premium subscriptions in Finland last month? And you end up with a sum of money. They then say, of all the streams that were serviced in the last month, what percentage came from any one label, any one artist, or any one track? Okay, so let's say it's a label. Let's say it's Universal Music. Let's say of all the tracks that were streamed, 20% were Universal Music controlled recordings. Then what the service says is, okay, we need to allocate 20% of our money to Universal Music. So Universal Music now has an allocation. But we could also do that on a track by track basis. Let's say one track accounted for 0.0001% of listening. We then allocate 0.0001% of revenue to that track. Now, I should add that this is done on a subscription type basis and a country basis. So this would be done for premium subscribers in Finland, premium subscribers in France, premium subscribers in the UK separately. And through this process, every track on the system and the songs contained in those tracks has an allocation of revenue. If we go on to the next slide, what do we then do with that allocation? Well, whatever money has been allocated to a track or a song or to a catalogue of music, the streaming service then has to share that money with its licensing partners. And generally, the recording side, whoever controls the recording rights, will get 50 to 55% of the allocation. Whoever controls the song rights in that track will get 10 to 15% of the allocation, which means, as you will see, that the service is aiming to keep 30 to 35% of the allocation. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. This is a very quick recap of everything I've just said with some actual figures in euros. So let's say that Spotify made €10 million selling subscriptions in France last month. Let's say that one track on Spotify accounted for 0.01% of all the streams that occurred in France by premium subscribers last month. Now we know what to allocate the track. It would be €1,000 because that would be 0.01% of the 10 million that came in. Of the €1,000, we're allocating 55% to whoever controls the recording rights. So that would be €550. We're allocating the song 15%. So that would be €150. So now the allocation has been made and the revenue has been shared. Next question. How do the artists and songwriters get paid? How much of that money do they see? So let's go on to the next slide. Let's talk about paying artists and songwriters. So the streaming service is going to pay on the recording side whichever label or distributor uploaded the track. So it says to the label and distributor, this track had this many streams, this percentage of listening, this is its allocation, here's your 55%. The label and distributor then shares that money with each artist, subject to the artist's contract. So if we go on to the next slide, artist contracts vary hugely. If the artist is working with a DIY distributor like TuneCore, they would get all of that money. But if they're working with a label on a traditional record deal, they're probably seeing no more than 25% of the money. If they're on a really old record deal, they could be seeing less than that. But of the revenue shared with the recording from the track allocation, what the artist sees is entirely subject to contract. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, that's the recording rights sorted. The label and distributor has been paid and money has been passed on to the artist. But in that recording is a song. Here's one more complication to throw into the mix. What song? Because the label uploaded the track. It provided some data about the track. But what it didn't do was identify specifically what song is in that track by the ISWC, the unique identifier for musical works. So Spotify doesn't actually know what song is contained in that recording. And so what Spotify actually does is it goes to all of its licensing partners on the song side, publishers and societies, and it says, here's a data list, a spreadsheet of every single track that streamed last month by ISRC. You need to go through that list and identify which recordings contain songs that you control. So if we go on to the next slide. Whereas on the recorded side, Spotify assumes that whoever uploaded the track must control the copyright in that track and therefore needs to be paid. But on the song side, the society or publisher representing the rights needs to claim the money from a report it receives about recordings that were streamed. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. What this means is every single month, on the publishing side, on the song side, societies and publishers need to match recordings to songs. Or to use the technical jargon on the next slide, we need to match the ISRC of the track to the ISWC of the song. And that's a major piece of work that your societies and your publishers, depending on how it's licensed, are having to do every month in order to claim the royalties they are due. Then the money flows to the society and the publisher, and then the songwriters are paid, with societies subject to society rules and with publishers subject to publishing contracts. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. As was said before I started talking, there have been a lot of debates about the way the streaming business works over the years, and particularly in the last year, partly because of all the revenue streams in the music industry, subscription streaming was the one revenue stream that proved to be COVID immune. Actually, streaming continued to grow throughout the year. But for the reasons I've already kind of alluded to, streaming is often a revenue stream where artists and songwriters see a relatively small amount of the money. Why? Well, because you will have seen that when the revenue share is happening, the recording is allocated a much bigger revenue share than the song. And of the money that is allocated to the recording, the majority of the money, artists on a traditional record deal will probably be seeing a minority of that money. And obviously, with all of the other music industry revenue streams hit by COVID, a big conversation has occurred. Is it right that artists and songwriters, because of the way the system works, often see a minority of this revenue stream. Now, these are all the different debates that are ongoing, and in our Dissecting Digital Dollar book, we talk about each of these in turn. But just to wrap up, let's quickly talk about two key debates of interest to you guys. So first of all, on the next slide, let's ask the question, why does the recording see so much more of the streaming money than the song? Why is 50 to 50% of a track allocation going to the recording rights, but 10 to 15% to the song rights? Basically because the starting point was the CD model. When downloads came along, the CD model was applied to downloads, but the song got slightly more. And when streaming came along, the download model was applied to streaming, but the song got slightly more. But the key point there is slightly more. So if we go on to the next slide, you will see that how monies are allocated between the song rights and the recording rights, we know this differs by revenue stream. Now, compared to CD, the song does a lot better on a stream. But some people would say, well, why did we begin with the CD model? Surely streaming is more like radio. And with radio, generally, there's much more parity between the recording rights and the song rights. If anything, the song rights probably earn more. So if we go on to the next slide, there is an ongoing debate about whether or not the slight reslicing of the pie that has occurred, because it is worth noting that while streaming has grown and evolved, the percentage going to the song has increased slightly and the percentage going to the recording has declined slightly. But slightly is the key word. So on the next slide, these are the various arguments for why some people would argue there should be a significant reslicing of the pie. Not a few percent more when we went from CD to download and a few percent more when we went from download to stream. A more significant reslicing of the pie. The argument being the reason why labels saw the majority of CD income was because of the costs and risks associated with making and distributing CDs. Many of those costs have disappeared. So why is the recording still getting so much more of the money? On the flip side of this debate, labels would argue, yes, they don't have physical manufacture and distribution costs anymore, but they still have significant risks. And if anything, the marketing costs have become much more significant in such a crowded marketplace. So there are arguments on both sides. This is what I call the digital pie debate. It's ongoing, and plenty of songwriters and publishers would argue that a more rigorous and significant reslicing of the deal needs to happen. Finally, on the next slide, let's quickly say something about the user-centric approach for royalty distribution. You've probably heard a lot about this. It's been another big talking point over the last year. Remember how I said when Spotify is working out what monies to allocate to every track, it's done on a subscription type level. So all the money for premium subscriptions in Finland is put into one pot, and all the streams from premium subscribers in Finland are calculated, and that is how the money is distributed. And then the same happens in France, the same in the UK, and so on. Some people would argue that that allocation of money to track should be happening at a user level, not a subscription level. So that each individual subscriber's money should be divided between the tracks that they listen to, and therefore the recordings and the songs contained in those tracks. And that's what we would call the user-centric approach to royalty distribution. Clearly, some Spotify subscribers listen to hours and hours and hours of music every day, whereas some only a few hours per week. So obviously, under the user-centric system, the average per play rate you would receive for a low-level user would be significantly more than for a high-level user. Under the current model, arguably, the low-level users are subsidizing the high-level users. So just to wrap up, let's quickly give you arguments for and against the user-centric approach. So on the next slide, people say that user-centric just seems fairer. It's probably what the fans want and assume is already happening. And some people argue that it would benefit middle-level and more niche artists. Arguments against on the next slide. Some people argue that shifting from the current system to user-centric would be expensive. User-centric is more complicated. And some people argue it wouldn't actually make that big a difference in terms of what money is allocated to each individual track. But it's another ongoing debate in the music industry. And finally, on my final slide, I would just make you aware that in addition to the argument that we should shift to a user-centric system, some other alternative ways of sharing out the money have been proposed in recent months, some by Impala, the Pan-European Organisation for the Independent Music Community. Last week, EXA, the Pan-European Organisation for Songwriters, also endorsed some of these. And the artist growth model is the idea that the first round of streams should earn more than the second and third and fourth round of streams, which would mean that those people who are getting 100,000 streams a month would benefit, and those who are getting millions and millions and millions of streams would see slightly less per stream, but obviously would still be making plenty of money overall. So, although a lot of conversation has been about the user-centric model, it is worth being aware that there are some other proposals out there for alternative ways to allocate music to tracks and then to share that money with artists and songwriters and the music industry at large. And so it's definitely worth checking out some of those other proposals as well. And that brings us to the end of my very speedy overview of dissecting the digital dollar and how the streaming business works. We will be sharing the slides with anybody who's interested. I know it's a lot to digest in a relatively small amount of time, but hopefully that has helped you get to grips with the basics of how, from a rights and royalties perspective, the streaming business works.
My name is Jari Muikku and work currently as the Executive Director of the Finnish Music Publishers Association. And I was asked to give a few additional notes on the subject of user-centric model. Well, as you see, the whole matter is very complex, like the whole digital economy of music. And I'm sure that the listeners who are not thoroughly familiar with the subject are, to use the old cliche, are kind of still confused, but on a higher level after Chris's presentation. But there are a lot of important topics Chris pointed out. So one of the reasons I was asked to talk a little bit about the user-centric model is that I was personally involved in a Finnish study which was done a few years ago. And there have been several studies during the past few years on this subject, and which have been done in countries like Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, France, UK, US, and so forth. And as Chris pointed out, these calculations and these statistics are based on artist shares, not on works, because works are considered to be too complex issue for making similar kind of analysis, just simply pointing out that there are so many different versions of the same works and so forth. And if I kind of simplify the results of this study so far, there have been similar kind of results. There are no silver bullets. There are no simple solutions to this problem. And if we talk about the consequences, they are uncertain, in some cases undesired. To be said, the thinking that this might kind of correct some of the wrongdoings or the unbalances or the niche side, the results might be even worse for these right holders. But if I point out the next slide is about the latest study which is done in France by a consulting company, Tulot, and the Centre National de la Musique, National Music Center in France. And they used data from two leading services in France, Spotify and Deezer, which is a French service. And this infograph simply points out that if you look at the artist ranking, you notice that the results show the drop of 10 to 15% for the top 10 tier. So the biggest artist would lose according to these studies. And if you look at the other end, you have the so-called long tail artists, 10,000 plus ranking places. So those are the ones which you can see some movement. But the middle tier, like Chris pointed out, there's been a saying that it was help this middle tier. But according to this study, for example, this is not the case. So if you look at the results of this study, it's if you talk about the musical genres, it looks like that the classical music, metal, blues, and jazz would be the winners compared to the pro rata system. And the losers would be hip-hop, rap, and the biggest hits of today. But in average, these studies pointed out that it's not clear who would be the winners and losers even in these genres. So it's very difficult to find general rules what things really kind of, what would be the results if we move from pro rata to user-centric model. And also one of the results of this, practical results of this study is that the long tail artist, that it's 10,000 plus ranking artist, would benefit only few euros on an annual level, which really wouldn't make a big difference, even though that the remunerations are quite limited. The result of the users applying the user-centric system depends on the interplay of many things, multiple factors, which are very difficult to control and very difficult to predict the result of this interplay. And the results will vary per individual artist, even within the same genre. It might be the result might be this for one metal band, but totally different for the other metal band for various reasons. This whole result depends mainly on the behavior of the fans, and that is something which is not predictable. And a few words about the main challenges of implementation. The uptake of a user-centric distribution system would require big enough common incentives why all the parties would move into this system. And these small internal changes are not simple enough for big catalog holders. They are insignificant for major labels, major publishers, who are the part of the same corporations. If you think about the major label or publisher who have a lot of huge amount of tracks or works in their catalogs, if one track loses, the other one wins. If they kind of go together so that the result is the same, so why do you do that? It's the same thing with the works. So that it's quite obvious that the change into the user-centric system would require other than financial incentives. And what I mean by this is that there would be a kind of a cultural, political, other reasons why we would move into a user-centric system. One of the examples is perhaps Chris can later comment on the ongoing, or which has been going through this year, the inquiry or discussions around streaming economy in the UK Parliament, where the equitable remuneration has been one of the leading themes of the debate, what should happen. But at the end of the day, whether we talk of pro rata or user-centric system, it doesn't increase the size of the cake as such. So it's a zero-sum game. If somebody loses, if somebody wins, somebody will eventually lose. So the total amount of money will not increase because we would move into the user-centric system. And I think one of the most critical things and the most crucial things is that if we would move into the user-centric system, what that would require is all the parties, that is to say labels, publishers, songwriters, artists, distributors, digital aggregators, and all digital service providers would have to move into the same model simultaneously. Because it's quite impossible to kind of think about a situation where, for example, Spotify would apply user-centric system and Apple would use still pro-rata system, and all the right holder organizations, labels, publishers would have to run two different kind of system on a parallel move. So that is simply not possible. So the eventual question is what Chris also pointed out, is that who would pay the expenses for moving into this system? Who would cover the expenses of the transformation is, of course, important question, because it would mean a lot of money, because it's not that easy as it sounds. And the latest note from me is that one of the things which people keep forgetting about the user-centric system is that there's a kind of risk of creating a lot of new kind of black box money. To say money which doesn't belong to anyone or is very unclear to whom it belongs to. So that we have a lot of paying customers who do not use the service at all. And the user-centric system is based on the idea that the premium service customer listens to at least one song per month. But if the amount of listened song is zero, where does that 10 euros go to? Who should get the money? How should it be distributed in that case? And this amount of these premium customers who do not just use the service at all is surprisingly high, especially if you talk about telecommunication company bundles. So there are a lot of people who might not do that. So it's a big issue if we would move into the system. And it's not a simple answer, it's a problem to solve. And paradoxically, it might be the solution might be using pro rata system, which is kind of we would end the circle. So we started from pro rata, moving to user-centric, but it might be some features which would require us to use pro rata system. So there would be a lot of other things to be said about this thing, but I will end up here and move into the discussion. So to hear from Vappu if we have any questions coming from the chat box. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. A lot of useful information, and thank you so much for Jari this little bit more detailed issue about user-centric model. We have few questions, but before that, I would like to ask both Chris and Jari, maybe Chris first. Do you see that music industry would transfer to user-centric model somewhere in the near future, which I mean like within next 5 years maybe? Is it that possible? Because there, like Jari said, there will be, and there is a lot of challenges and open questions as well. So what do you say about that, Chris?
As an interesting question, isn't it? I think it's interesting here in the UK. You mentioned the inquiry that's taken place in the Parliament here in the UK on the economics of streaming. User-centric has come up at various points during that inquiry, and the official position of most music companies seems to be we are agnostic on whether or not we go for the current model or the user-centric model. And indeed, most of the streaming services, we're agnostic on whether or not we keep the current model or we go for user-centric model, but then immediately provide a list of reasons why there are challenges with user-centric. So officially they are agnostic, but then actually they say, but you know what? There are issues with this model and it's not the fix that some people think. Obviously, Deezer has been trying to get a trial underway on the recorded side in France and possibly in Germany as well. But it would need to get the entire record industry on side. And to date, it hasn't managed to do that, although it continues to talk optimistically that maybe a trial could take place. SoundCloud has introduced user-centric, but for its independent creator community. Because SoundCloud is interesting because there's two sides to SoundCloud. There's the side of SoundCloud that's like any other streaming service where you have licensing deals with labels and distributors. That stays the same. But then you have the community who directly upload content into SoundCloud and have a direct relationship with SoundCloud. And for the independent creator community, user-centric is now underway. So I suspect that labels are going to be watching what happens with that SoundCloud experiment with close interest. And as I say, nobody's coming out outright and saying we don't want user-centric, but lots of people are raising issues with the model. So I don't know with certainty that we're going to see a change on this in the next year or even the next 5 years.
What about you, Jari?
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with Chris, and there might be this kind of cultural and political reasoning which says that they're agnostic or it might be even a good solution. But if you go down to the kind of financial basics and really doesn't make any sense, for the big right holders, it probably wouldn't make any sense to change because it wouldn't change the situation at all. But I think the reason that it's good you mentioning the SoundCloud pilot, I think we really need these kind of pilots in order to get the real data, because the problem with all these studies have been that they are based on a limited amount of data. They are backwards and really kind of being able to monitor all the different aspects which really affect the result. We really need more information on that and really to have a kind of basis whether there's a strong enough reasoning for that. And also from the administration side, I think it's quite natural for these do-it-yourself artists or let's say the players in the business who have all the rights, one company or one person who controls all the rights, it probably would make sense. But with this very fragmented situation where we have hit songs of almost 10 different writers and 15 different publishers having this framework which is extremely complicated. So it's very difficult to see how it would change overnight. So personally, having during the past few years talking to different people in different positions of the music industry, I feel quite pessimistic about the possibility. But I think I would probably like to stress out that if we get a kind of a hard evidence that seeing how it actually works and what are the results, it might be change the course of the discussion.
So yeah, more information and more data is still needed. Very interesting issue. Many comments are saying that, Chris, you are really fast speaker and there was a lot of information in your presentation. So we had one quite long question here in the beginning of our webinar, which he asked that how to separate the money from digital distributors, report to the right receivers, so the publishers, the writers, the performers. So can you go through the part talking about the deals and percentages one more time?
Yes, of course. I realise that most of you are tuning in a second language, so I apologise if I was talking too fast. So I suppose the first thing to add is every label, every distributor, every publisher, every society has their own deal, and every deal is slightly different. And many of those deals are confidential. But generally speaking, of any money allocated to a track, between 50 and 55% will be allocated to the recording and then be paid to a label and a distributor. And then 10 to 15% will be allocated to the song and then paid to the publisher or the society, which means the service is trying to keep 30 to 35% for itself. So if you just look at the money coming into the music industry, that means it's approximately an 80-20 split. So of the money coming into the music industry, approximately 80% will be going to the song and the opposite way around. 80% will be going to the recording and 20% to the song. So the recording will be seeing 4 times more than the song. Under the current deals that have been done, as I say, all of these things are approximations, but that's approximately what is happening to the money.
Yes, thank you, Chris, because there was a question that asked for a specific map how to pay everyone. So we don't have that, obviously, but we have approximation. Thank you so much. Then we had some interesting questions. There are comments that I would like to have this in Finnish for everyone. We'll probably arrange more webinars about this issue in Finnish as well. And what about live streaming of concerts? That's one issue that we haven't talked about, and maybe we don't have time for that now. But do you have, Chris, how is live streaming of concert? What is the situation in UK and in music industry in general? That is a huge question that has just arisen during COVID pandemic.
Yes, obviously, although live streaming isn't new, properly commercializing ticketed live stream concerts has properly come of age during the pandemic. And some artists, some promoters, some managers have done big shows. So yes, how do we license this? Obviously, on the recorded side, recordings aren't being used. Recordings are being created, but they're not being used. So unless it's a DJ set, we don't need to license the recording rights. But songs definitely are being performed. And yet I think one of the debates that erupted once it became clear that ticketed live streaming was going to take off is the way we license live shows and the way we license streaming is very different. The way we license live shows is a lot simpler. It's a blanket license. It's a percentage of ticket money. It's done on a country by country basis. It's very simple. As you've seen here today, the way streaming is licensed is very complicated. So I think there was a hope early on, can we license it more like a live show? Because that's simpler. There are various reasons why we can't do that. Not least because a live stream tends to be global, and obviously a live show by definition is not. So it looks like, although there isn't complete consensus across the world, but it does look like live streams are going to be licensed more like a stream. Now, in most of continental Europe, that can be done by a society. Obviously, in Anglo-American markets, then you have the question, well, does that mean we've got to involve the publishers? Here in the UK, PRS are trying to have a one-stop license, involving the publishers in that license, bringing the mechanical rights and the synchronization rights to the table. But there is still lots of debate, and there is lots of, there's two things, which is how do we license it and what's the price? And I think there are disagreements on how we should license it, and there are definitely some disagreements on what the price should be. So yeah, it's too soon to tell, but I think it's going to be more like a stream than it is like a live show.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Chris. When it comes to Finland, the situation is pretty much the same. So that we currently have two different types of licenses in Finland for live stream concerts. We have Mediapienlupa, and then we have Live-striimauslupa. But we have tried to calculate different models, and we are facing some changes in these licensings in the beginning of June again. So, like Chris explained, that we are in a situation that we are trying to find the model that would be a correct model for licensing the live stream concerts. So we'll see what will be the fixed model for this. Do you have a comment on this, Jari?
Yeah, certainly. Like Chris said, that there's international debate going on. What's the basic paradigm of licensing live stream concerts? So whether it should be taken as a live concert, where the rate would be something 2, 3, 4% of the income, or whether it should be kind of considered as a digital income, where it would be between 10 and 15%. So it immediately kind of raises the question, which is, and of course the right holders are favoring having to be a part of this streaming regime, so to say. But I think the problem is that the live streaming as a whole, the phenomenon is so new, and it's emerging, it's evolving all the time, and there'll be different kind of things going on. But I think that one of the main concerns from the right holders' point of view is really getting hold of the income. For example, it might be a live stream, a free live stream, but there's a lot of commercial sponsor money involved. So like they be paying that the customer pays nominal fee for the license, but it might be kind of hundreds of thousands of euros of turnover in the event, which kind of sounds funny if we get for only a few tens of euros for that license. So it doesn't match. So there's a lot of issues going on. And of course, it's something we just have to follow how the market kind of keeps on going and where it goes, and really find out the right ways to license that.
Okay, I think we have still time for one very interesting question. There is as a practical matter, what would it take to move to a situation where the cake between labels and songwriters from streaming would be shared the same way as from traditional broadcasting? What would it take, Chris?
I suppose the challenge there is that because labels and distributors do their deals and publishers and societies do their deals separately, obviously with the CD, the label was the customer of the publisher and the songwriter. So there was a transaction where we could debate on the price. Obviously, in some countries that was set in law. But with streaming, sort of the services are kind of caught in the middle, that the societies and publishers say, well, we need a bigger cut. And they will say, well, we've already given all the money to the labels and distributors. So it is tricky. Having said that, there has been a reslicing of the pie over the last 10 years, only a few percent. Maybe that's not enough. But we have seen a slight reslicing of the pie. So the question is, does that trend continue? And as every 10 years go by, a few percent more is going to the song. Or you do sense from some labels and distributors, they are basically now saying, this is it. This is as much as we can afford. So I think, it is tricky, and in terms of what's been happening here in our parliament, whether or not copyright law can intervene on this, I don't know if it can. I don't know if there is a lawmaker solution. So I guess it is trying to get all the strands of the music industry together and having a conversation where we say, okay, what are the labels' risks? What are these new marketing costs? Can you justify taking so much more of the money? And if not, how do we make a more substantial reslicing of the pie happen? But I think it is a challenge, and I don't think, like with user-centric, I don't think there's going to be an overnight solution.
Yes, but there is going to be a lot of discussion, right? What about you, Jari?
Yeah, just to follow up what Chris said, that it's a good example of the difficulties of the legal path, the situation in the US, where there's a kind of a law which says that the share of the songwriters and publishers should increase in streaming services. But the whole legislation have been kind of taken into court by the big tech companies, so it hasn't been kind of implemented yet. So, and it likes this kind of delay of several years, and they should be starting renegotiating the next 5 years without resettling the past 5 years. So the situation is very difficult, and the opponent parties are also very different. But of course, the radio broadcasting world is a bit different. But still, it's a very complex issue. You need kind of a stick and carrot in that case as well.
So no ready answers for that question either.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we are running out of our time. We would have had more questions, but all this material will be shared with you with the link. So both the slides that Chris and Jari presented and the recording of this webinar. So hopefully you can go back to them and rethink everything that has been said today. Thank you so much, our active listeners. Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, Jari. And the work continues.